This is the Middle-earth philosopher. The stewards of Gondor usually hit me as antagonists. Everyone's already familiar with Denethor, which clearly doesn't help the PR that much, but also to its predecessors, sticklers for tradition and the Gondorian way of doing things, even when it seems to make little sense. But I don't think I've really been that fair to them, or acknowledged the actual nuance that went into their worldview and why they were that way, so I'm going to examine that. The interesting thing about the stewards of Gondor is that they don't really come into account until the succession crisis, where then King Ondahir was killed in the east along with his sons, fighting everyone's favorite king killers, the Easterlings. This incident left Gondor with no king on the throne, even though Ondahir had a daughter, Feriel, who had married an Arthedain nobleman named Aragorn. That noble, whose own kingdom of Arthedain was also in trouble with their own wars with Angmar, now sought to lay claim to the throne through his marriage to Feriel, as well as the shared Númenórean heritage of both Arthedain and Gondor. And this made Gondor really squeamish. Anytime that anyone starts messing or toying with any of Gondor's traditions and cultural lifestyles, it almost leads to trouble. They've already had one devastating civil war because of it, and I've heard the argument that it was because of that they were as squeamish now with this claim from a foreign entity. Even though that, yes, they had a shared heritage, they were both still separate nations with separate priorities and separate cultures, basically. In fact, it's said that Gondor didn't pretty much care about Arthedain or anything in the north by that point, because they were deemed small and pretty much insignificant. While Gondor, even though their troubles with the Easterlings and Harad were kind of consistent, was still a major powerhouse. Gotta share the love there. Now, having said all that, it was the role of the steward to rule in the king's place when he was not around. So, since the king is dead, presumably, then steward named Pelandir was at the forefront of this debate, and he was the one, it said, who pretty much led the disagreement that Arnor was not going to take control of the throne of Gondor. This wasn't just an issue of placeholding, however, but also gatekeeping, the gatekeeping of Gondorian heritage and tradition, as well as the safety of the people. This is something that you see in Denethor later on, as well as during this crisis. Now, at first, Pelandir's rejection that he gave to Arnor, or I should say Arthedain rather, was based on that Gondor does not acknowledge the rule of kings through the women of the line. Now, of course, I have to wonder what Feriel thought about all this, that her own people were saying, yeah, you don't count when it comes to rule of kingship here. Sorry about that. That must have been weird. However, Aragorn countered Pelandir's argument by saying that their ancestors did follow the rule of the kings through their women as well, because Númenor was also known for having ruling queens. It was a legal loophole that was entirely legit and that Pelandir never acknowledges, funny enough. That being said, if I wanted to make the sexist argument, I couldn't just make that about Gondor, because based on Aragorn's own argument, he shouldn't be the king, Feriel should be the queen. Okay, she's the one who should be claiming that throne. But, it is what it is, whatever. Steward Pelandir instead finds an alternative by finding a distant relative of King Ondahir in the form of Arnil, who was a general of Gondor's armies, and a successful general at that. And a unanimous decision was made to make that person king. Now, I feel it's worth mentioning that Arnil actually had some integrity and some honor about him, so he actually did try to honor the legacy of their ancestors with Arthedain, but that's a side point. What the situation shows that by the first mention of the stewards by name, it establishes what they are primarily about. The philosophy of the stewards was that it was loyal to the institution of Gondor, Númenor and everything else be damned, if need be. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I did come across one theory that part of the reason why Pelandir was so reluctant about making an outsider king of Gondor was because of their history with the kin strife, and that's a legit argument. During that time, Gondor's obsession with maintaining tradition and heritage was a lot more fundamentalist, I would say, to the point where they would kill each other over it if need be, hence the kin strife. And what that led to was so much destruction that a lot of the Númenórean bloodlines in Gondor got wiped out. And this theory basically goes that that memory was still strong in the minds of the nobles and the people of Gondor, and they didn't want to make a repeat of that. And I actually find that kind of a legitimate argument. That, in a way, this was actually Gondor trying to make a compromise, basically. So that essentially, Gondor weren't the hardcore fundamentalists that they were, but they're still fundamentalists all the same. However, the stewards of Gondor also had the role of advising the king as well, and speaking truth to power, which is what was trying to happen with, ironically, Ernil's son, Eornr. And I'm probably saying it wrong, so if I am, please forgive me. But essentially, Eornr was a prince, more or less, when he went to war up north trying to kick the Witch King out of the fallen kingdoms of Arthedain. Again, it was Ernil honoring the legacy and promise of their ancestry of Númenor to Arnor and Arthedain, because Ernil wasn't a dick, basically. But that said, he had so much courage that he was ready to charge after the Witch King, who had terrified everyone into fleeing from him except himself, and he was ready to go one-on-one with him. But that didn't happen. The Witch King got away, and Ernir felt humiliated from this, and he was really, really pissed about it, and was eventually convinced not to go after him. Interesting enough, the Witch King wasn't entirely happy about this either, even though that creepy-ass laugh of his made everyone else think otherwise. He challenged now King Eornir to a duel, and Ernir was ready to take him up on it, but it was his own steward, a man named Mardil, who warned him not to do it because the Witch King was trying to deceive him. And that at that point in time, Eornir listened. But eventually the Witch King came back, challenged him again, and the insult was enough that this time Eornir was not going to ignore it, and Mardil's advice was rejected. And of course, as everyone knows, this led to him disappearing in Minas Ithil, never to be seen again. Now, this again puts the stewards in another succession crisis, because now Eornir had no sons, and apparently there were no other relatives left that were related to the line of kings of Gondor, where they can just pick up someone from there and say, hey, you're the king now, maintain tradition. Also, too, even if they wanted to make a Northern Dunedain king, that too was no longer an option, because as far as they knew, all the northern kings were now wiped out. So it was at that point that the line of what was known as the ruling stewards began, starting with Mardil himself. And even this particular succession crisis establishes something about the philosophy of the stewards. In this case, that being that in their eyes, it was not their place to make imperial decisions. They were not there to adapt the rules or tradition or change the rules or tradition, but to guard it and protect it in the place of the king should he not be available. It's about the same thing as how the popes in real life see canon regarding the Bible and their version of Christianity and making any changes to it. Even though they're supposed to be the quote-unquote descendants or spiritual descendants of Peter, they're not allowed to make any changes to biblical tradition as they see it. That being said, this still made the stewards kings and princes in everything but name only. They ruled like it, they tended to act like it, both good and bad, and for a while this worked. If the Witch King's plan was to basically behead Gondorian hierarchy descended into chaos, this action by Mardil allowed it to fail. But again, the stewards are the keeper of tradition. So in that line of tradition, they did not take up the king's seat in Minas Tirith. The seat was left vacant for the king to quote-unquote return, even though everyone pretty much knew that was not happening. So therefore, the steward's seat was this little ass seat in the lower corner of this great empty seat that pretty much dominated the hall. That must have been kind of awkward. Not even keeping the seat warm, basically. But that pretty much sums up the philosophy of the stewards. That from stewards to ruling stewards to regular stewards after the fall of Sauron, their role is to protect Gondor, protect the laws and traditions, and to protect the people. And above all, they weren't as much loyal to the king as much as loyal to those aspects that they were assigned to protect. Watch over everything that Gondor is supposed to represent. And looking at it from that light, I can no longer really criticize the stewards for their actions either, to a point even Denethor, because it was probably this decision, controversial as it was in its history, that saved Gondor from falling into the same trap as its northern cousins, that being division and civil war. So yeah, the stewards definitely had their uses, and they definitely accomplished a lot of good in what they did during that time. That being said, there is an irony to this as well that I'm going to end out with. That being that eventually a king from the north does come from the line of a woman who did ultimately take up the throne once the stewards and Gondor had finally run out of options and traditions, and basically all of them had run their course and there was nothing left except their own destruction. That the rise of King Elisar, aka Aragorn, to the throne of Gondor, and thereby reestablishing honor, was a forced change in Gondorian tradition, because by that point, Gondorian tradition, again, controversial and arguably messed up as it was, had, for all its good purposes that it had saved Gondor from, run its course, and it had now become a dead end. Yet, at the same time, the stewards did their job. They preserved Gondor long enough so that it could weather those changes later on. And to that, I have to give it credit. So if you have any ideas or comments or even criticisms about that, let me know in the comments below. Have a good day.